A third aspect of infrastructure is that the benefits and costs are not often limited to the direct users and providers of that infrastructure. So, if you take the example of benefits, well, we talk of the direct users. Very often the value of an infrastructure also goes to many non-direct users. Similarly, when we talk of a provisioning of inputs for the infrastructure, there are direct providers, but very often in the process of providing that infrastructure, there are other indirect stakeholders who get affected by it. So, whether the benefits or costs move out of what can be viewed as a direct context to other indirect stakeholders, we say infrastructure exhibits externalities. This makes the framework in which we look at infrastructure a little more complex because of the externalities. Let me elaborate these 3 points. Let us look at the example of the natural monopoly. So, here I show the average cost curve. So, on the y-axis we have the average cost, and on the x-axis we have the output from that infrastructure. And as you can see, the average cost curve keeps on reducing as more and more output is made available, and it keeps on reducing until whatever is the maximum output that we actually need to be providing, which is the total demand of that society. And therefore, if you want to provide infrastructure at the least cost, then you would want to have a single entity that provides the entire infrastructure, because that is what would give you the least cost, leveraging the economies of scale and to an extent of scope that we talked about earlier. We mentioned national resources, land, contiguous land, coastline, spectrum, forests and mangroves. The issue is not only about the opportunity cost of the resource versus the value of infrastructure development. Question is, who determines it? Is there enough science, enough analytical capabilities that would allow us to say, hey, this is the value of using the infrastructure, of using the resource for infrastructure development, versus that resource not being available for something else? Who determines that, and by what process? These become critical. Of course, in a democratic country, the political processes often are the best way to determine this. So, if I build a road and a bit of forest land has to be taken away for the road, then what is the value we are deriving by putting that road, versus what are we losing out in terms of the nature or natural habitat that would have depended on that part of the forest that we would be taking away. Question is, who determines and by what process? To elaborate the idea of externalities, I am trying to give a simple framework to put all this in a financial context. Typically, when we want to invest in any economic activity, since finances are involved, we would expect a certain rate of return based on that infrastructure, and that rate of return we say is the hurdle rate. That's the minimum rate that we would expect from investments. Of course, the hurdle rate could vary depending on the context, could vary depending upon who is investing, but in general the hurdle rate would vary marginally around what is an acceptable number. There are two forms of returns for infrastructure. First, we say financial rate of return. The financial rate of return is where you can clearly see what are the cash flows that are associated with that infrastructure, both in terms of how much money is going into creating that infrastructure and what are the revenues we are getting from that. So let's just say what goes in is like a denominator and what we get as a return is the numerator, and when we divide that return by what we are investing in, we have a rate of return. And if that is associated with the clearly determinable cash flows, we say that's the financial rate of return. But since we earlier talked about externalities, there are other costs or costs borne by other stakeholders, and similarly there could be revenues that other stakeholders get the benefit of due to infrastructure. If we include the costs and the benefits or returns that the indirect stakeholders get, and if we are able to assess all of that along with the financial costs and returns that we could earlier assess, the totality would be called as the economic rate of return. Economic rate of returns could be higher than the financial rate of return or could be lower. Okay, with this background, we can categorize infrastructure projects and activities into four types. We could have a situation where both the economic rate of return and financial rate of return are higher than the hurdle rate. In such a case, we would not worry about whether the financial rate of return is higher or lower than the economic rate of return. It's sufficient to know that both are above the hurdle rate. In such a case, can we reflect on whether that's a project as a society we should be investing in? Well, the answer should be obvious, that if both are above the hurdle rate, then that money is well spent, and therefore that project we should definitely invest in too. Let me go to the other extreme and talk of the situation when both economic rate of return and financial rate of return are lower than the hurdle rate. Again, it would not matter whether the economic rate of return is higher or lower than the financial rate of return. What's important is both are below the hurdle rate, and therefore that's an infrastructure we should not be considering at this point. So these are two situations where it's very clear how we go about doing that infrastructure. Where the complexity increases are two other categories. Let's take the example of the economic rate of return being higher than the financial rate of return, and obviously to take it away from the earlier two categories where the economic rate of return is above the hurdle rate while the financial rate of return is below the hurdle rate. So this is a situation where the very visible cash flows indicate that the project may not be a project that is worth doing because the financial rate of return is below the hurdle rate. However, if we are able to assess the externalities and see that the economic rate of return is higher and in fact above the hurdle rate, then as a society it is an infrastructure project that is worth investing into. What is important is that we need to build a conviction that that economic rate of return is indeed happening. Fine. Now let's move on to the other category where the externalities are more negative in nature. And we take the example where the visible cash flows leading to the financial rate of return is above the hurdle rate, which means in a more obvious sense it would appear that this project should be done. However, if there are negative externalities, then it is possible that the economic rate of return is below the hurdle rate, which is what this category is, because remember, if both of them are above the hurdle rate, then we are in the first category that I talked about and there are no issues about doing the project. But here the economic rate of return is below the hurdle rate. The question then is, should society be investing in this project? In fact, very often the society may actually get on to doing this project without worrying about the negative externalities which are not so visible and end up finally having an economic rate of return lower than the hurdle rate, and therefore society may end up hurting itself. Well, here the challenge would be, can I use my surplus of the financial rate of return to mitigate the negative externalities and see if I can push the economic rate of return above the hurdle rate, in which case it is a project that may be worth considering. So, to summarize, we can categorize the infrastructure returns into 4 vis-a-vis the hurdle rate: economic rate of return and financial rate of return both being above the hurdle rate, yes, we go ahead with the project. Both below the hurdle rate, no, we don't do the project. Economic rate of return is above the financial rate of return and above the hurdle rate, yes, we should do the project, but by developing a greater clarity on the actual outcomes of that economic rate of return. And finally, where the financial rate of return is above the hurdle rate and might actually give a push to doing the project, but the economic rate of return is lower, well, in such a case we should only do the project if we can use the surpluses of the financial rate of return to mitigate the negative consequences of the economic rate of return.